All right, and first on the agenda is Ali to talk about labeled perf counters for user quota.
Yeah, I know in the past when we discussed this, we were looking for use cases or first things to label and send off to Prometheus. And Matt had pointed me at this RFE that where a downstream customer would like to be able to view in Prometheus per RGW user metrics, and specifically the quota allocated to the user and their current usage, the number of objects and bytes that they're using. From what I understand, we already check this stuff or get this information when we run check quota or in the existing quota code. So I think it would just be a matter of creating new label per user, updating their stats, and then sending that out or putting that in the same perf counters collection that the rest of the counters go into. Um, the only issue is I think we'd still need some kind of store when for when like the same user's quota is updated over and over again. Something along those lines. We need some kind of cache.
So doesn't that make it convergent with what the work you did for temporarily, creating a temporarily local store for for information related to a label counter?
Yeah, so
we're not going to store. I mean, we're not going to store. We're not changing how the underlying quota information lives, nor are we probably going to say that we are going to permanent once we you know what I'm saying once we if we see a quota enforcement event, we could define that as an event that gets eventually to Prometheus, but we're not going to send it over and over and over just because that one user saw it one time, and we're not going to send all the other users that haven't had any enforcement event.
Oh, I see. So you want to send this more on an event basis and less on a anytime some users updated, quotas updated.
Well, I assume it has to be something like that. Otherwise, it isn't really. I mean, otherwise, it's otherwise the obligation to ship the information overwhelms any reasonable system. We're not going to be able to scavenge all the information about users' quota and send it periodically to Prometheus. I don't believe. If we did, that would have to be done very infrequently, and etc. Down a rat hole.
Right. Our existing perf counters are just event-based, right? We get a read op and we increment a counter for number of read ops. It sounds like if they want a graph of user quota or user stats versus quota in Prometheus, then we would have to have like a timer of some interval, like every minute, read stats, read their quota, and send that information to Prometheus. And like Matt said, I don't think that scales, especially if you want a small granularity and lots of users.
But what we could do based on the work that you guys already did, like with the hit cache and for counter hit cache, you could define some events like changing quota and enforcing quota on particular users and keep them in there for whatever the defined period is, a minute, 10 minutes, whatever. And you can send the things that we've currently seen to Prometheus.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
We've already gotten the rest of the group and the Ceph consumers of Prometheus to agree that labeled counters can be sparse and transient. Whether they actually for the first time they actually see such a thing, their heads may explode. But I'm confident that Ilya and at least a few other people don't understand what we're talking about here.
So Matt, are you proposing that we only do some kind of counter when we deny a request because of quota exceeded?
Or it could, or maybe quota accessed. I'm not quite sure. I mean, that would be much more expensive, but not crazy, because we're accumulating them in the cache. So maybe we would accumulate them into the cache when something happens that's relevant, and drop out of the cache whenever we, following the rules you guys agreed to, like every 3 minutes when we dump the stuff that hasn't been updated. So we'd have like a snapshot of activity that reflects just similar. This is how I've come to see some of the things where people are asking for, like, what are the hot, when they want to know all the bucket, when they want to know all information about buckets in their application, what they really want to know is what's the system doing, and what are users doing, and we could define that around quota as, in a couple of ways, but that's like not just quota denials necessarily. But maybe in the case of quota, that would be the correct semantic. I'm just noodling, but possibly, but either that or on accesses and denials maybe. But I definitely think that keeping trying to define it as moving current information, and moving snapshot of what's happening with asynchrony, with asynchronous semantics would be the right, would be useful and is tractable, I think. But everything that involves knowing all the buckets and knowing all the users and knowing all of this and all of that, but that's more or less impossible to do in the event system. They should come up with some job that grovels on that and periodical, if they want that. I mean, does that make sense? Does that seem plausible to you?
I don't know. I still don't think that just the cache alone is going to solve the scalability problem in Prometheus. I mean,
well, okay. What I mean is, let's lay it right down. I mean, scaling the. I don't know what it solves. I mean, it reduces a lot of activity. The caching reduces and restriction, and the restrictions on the size of the cache and the age of the cache. Hopefully reduce the problem to a table of current information that we're willing to that we have at any given at any given instant, and we expect that it will be consumed periodically by Prometheus, as long as we can keep that. As long as the utility. I mean, we have to be able to define a size of such a table of information that can be kept up to date at reasonable cost. If it ends up being unuseful, I mean, then I guess it's broken. But if it's too small, or things drop out of it too fast, or whatever.
but I mean, assuming though that the number of users is essentially unbounded.
The numbers of users is unbounded, but is the number of users in the last 10 minutes unbounded?
No, but I mean, we still have to feed counters. We'll still be feeding counters for every user in the system to Prometheus, and it'll be stored in its database. I don't know how long it lives there, but it's not just the 10 minutes.
Okay, hold on. Okay, I got now. I see where you're going. Well, as far as I can tell, I mean, if our system, our cache has the right semantics for dealing with the framework, with the framing I proposed. If it goes and the ability, I think, there's been plenty of miscommunication about what Prometheus is doing, but I understood it to be the case after 2 years of negotiating and talking with different people, Ilya and me and other people, Paul Kuzner, that it's plausible to have a counter that whose Prometheus view is the top 10x. So it could be the top 10 labeled the top 10 values for the current, let's say ops per bucket, or ops per user. And that counter could be we could define the semantics of that counter coming out of us and through the exporter to be either one, to be the current value, that would mean the current top 10 at any given time. and then it would not imply a historical view of all the summarized information that it ever got. If it did, I mean, clearly, I think you're correct. Prometheus would fall over, and I haven't explored what Prometheus is doing with it, but I've been told that such a counter can exist. And if that is true, that's how I would define something like this. And similarly, the top 10 replicating buckets in multi-site and the top 10 busy users or active users in the regular system, or etc. And similarly.
Okay, so it would be the top 10 user labels, and those would be the only ones that were persisted in Prometheus for some given window.
Or the top 10 user label combinations. So like, so yeah, I mean, there's a different counter for user this and user doing this and user doing that maybe. But I think so, and I don't know what's but I don't know anything about really what's persisted in Prometheus, but to some extent, I'm thinking that some of these counters should be treated by Prometheus as ephemeral, and hopefully it can handle that. I'm told that is a thing with some of these labeled. I think the labeling is a thing that is a terminology from there. I thought of this as something else initially, but as parametric essentially. But I mean, but going back to my conversation with Jason Tillman 2 years ago, it seemed he was convinced that this is cogent and nobody and it's gradually seems like more people agree to it, although no one has yet. To be fair, no one has yet explained it to me in a Prometheus-centric way that I found.
Yeah.
That gave me total confidence.
So, I mean, maybe we don't have any counter stuff for quotas at the moment. Maybe just trying to send our existing app counters with a user label on them and figuring out how to limit what Prometheus stores and investigate it from that standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That does.
Yeah,
and
like working backwards.
We should start to. I mean, adding to what you're just saying, I think we're saying the same, a compatible thing. We should define what the set of what the snapshot view of each of such a label counter should be, and as it flows through the system, I mean, hopefully Prometheus will understand that the same thing is now changed from X to Y, and all will be well. But if they come back to with your melting Prometheus, then we will apply force appropriately. But I can assure you, we've explained this, and I particularly have explained this in great detail using technology, using terminology like sparse and transients over and over and over and over and over. And lots of people have claimed to understand what I'm saying.
Okay, well, right, maybe, I don't know, maybe there's some magic that we need to do with Prometheus to describe the things that are.
That's true. That's true. Although the people who work on Prometheus have nodded and hand waved at this, and when I think we just have to cross the Rubicon with it because it follows from other things that are going on. It's just the same problem arises effectively from the work that Ilya is doing with RBD. By the way, as the set of volumes grows and changes, the matrix of counters grows accordingly without obvious bound. And so if Prometheus were accumulating them all and representing this matrix forever, it melts, just as it does with the counters we've been talking about in RGW.
Well, I'm not so sure, because when we were discussing this with Ilya lately, he said scalability is not a problem for RBD because it has a strict limit of like 100 on the number of images.
It has a strict limit on the number of images that are. As far as I understand, this number of images that can be actively producing counters, and so he didn't need something like our multi-dimensional cache. But over on the Prometheus side, the number of volumes in an RBD is not limited to 100 by user, etc.
Okay, then yeah, that does sound similar. Okay, so in prior discussions, we were talking about maybe having the user control which buckets or users we were tracking counters for, but if Prometheus can handle this, then I guess the cache might be enough.
I'd definitely like to see that, try to prove that assertion, because I think it's useful, and I think it scales well, and then
So how do we get the right people involved to do an experiment with this?
Well, is the experiment being seeing what seeing how Prometheus blows over or what it can handle?
well, I think it's basically the next. I think it's basically part of the second phase work by that Juan Mi is proposing to do. That says we're already doing. So for example, it could be the mix in of our counters with the labeled counters that are coming from RBD. So now I think from downstream perspective, I think we've agreed that doesn't, the RGW stuff, the RGW counters aren't going into 6.1, so it's more of an upstream part that lands when it's ready. And yeah, if the train derails, as it were, it should happen very quickly, and it won't hurt anyone, we hope.
Okay, so the first step for Ali would be adding a user label to our existing front-end counters, but then we would need some testing that has a workload with a whole bunch of users.
Okay, do we have such a thing? We have workloads with all kinds of buckets, and so if we put it in, if we did the same project with bucket, you could test it sort of the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Because we do have those.
And just so I'm clear, the goal is to is the goal initially to, I'm not implementing a cache, I'm just sending it all to Prometheus and seeing what happens. What we would expect to happen is it to blow over some way, or is there some step in the middle I missed?
I think that this work presumes that there's a cache in RGW.
Oh, okay.
And I mean, the cache wouldn't really be tracking the top N of any particular counter. It would just be based on an LRU cache, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we would end up feeding Prometheus all of the stuff in our existing cache and rely on it to only remember the top end things.
When you say it, you mean Prometheus to remember the top end things.
Right. But I mean, right, something would have to tell Prometheus what the sort order is, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Or maybe that's for every individual counter. I don't know how it works.
Okay. Figuring out how that works, I mean, on top of whatever else you're saying, is also something they can figure out.
So what all was left to do with the cache part itself?
Yeah,
I remember that it was still missing some locking.
Yeah, and I mean, here's the other thing: is currently all the counters are stored in a Ceph context perf counters collection, and they're all just dumped in a map or something like that. And the only thing which from what I understand, is thread safe. The only thing that collection thing didn't have is some kind of get method internally to get something from it and to return like a perf counter from a key in that collection. Do you think it would be worth it to just build off of the collection or to spliff off something else entirely?
I think the collection is probably fine. I mean, it manages the the collection under a mutex, and so if the cache was just adding and removing things under that lock, then I think it would be fine.
Okay.
But the cache would need its own thread safety for its own lookups and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it would be the cache itself that has a get function for the set of labels, I think, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I can I'll soak up all of this and then probably shoot out a follow-up email.
All right. Yeah, it sounds like the cache is the first step, and then adding bucket labels to the front end counters, and then finding a way to test it and see how it scales.
Got it. Matt, does that sound good to you?
It sounds exactly perfect to me.
Cool. So, what happens in the multi-gateway instance? Or I guess that's something we'll find out on the Prometheus end. Like if like
I-
4
I-
gateways are getting shuffled by some load balancer in front of it.
My assessment has always been that among the jobs of the exporter would be to consolidate those. It either does or it doesn't.
Okay.
Right. I mean, the existing perf counter model, each gateway keeps its own counters, and the manager knows what to do to combine them or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's the same with the exporter model.
Okay.
I think Paul Kusner believed that was the case. Let's see if the kids did it.
I'll look into that to some extent as well, but got it.
Yeah, my understanding is that the counters are all going to the same place in the end, but the daemon name ends up being a label,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how you can look at the different ones.
So yeah, that may imply that they call away Prometheus with that. That's well, but if it does that rather than consolidating them, it makes sense. What do they want to do?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there's always been a way to have like a Grafana view of a single daemon based on that label.
Yeah, given that, yeah, that occurs to me. That's true. So yeah, that implies they're not being aggregated in the exporter.
All right, thanks, Ali. Any other thoughts on perf counters? Next on the agenda, I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that the Ceph organization on GitHub is going to require two-factor authentication. Once we make that switch, people that don't have it enabled will be removed from the organization, and we'll have to re-invite you once you enable it. There was an announcement on the dev list. I think that announcement said April 1st was when it was going to happen, but it might be delayed a little bit. But get on it anyway.
maybe, well, I wish I'd spoken up in the CLP call, because what they should do, maybe you could hint this to Ilya or somebody. What they should do is do it in 2 steps and give it a few weeks between bounce it, basically for have the organization require it, which makes GitHub require it, and then after that, after a couple weeks of that, disable it across the org.
I mean, my understanding was that we were going to change an option in GitHub that requires it, and changing that would remove all users that don't have it enabled. I don't know if there's a way to do it in those 2 steps.
Huh. And I can't remember why I already did it a year ago, but something prompted me to do it. It was really easy to switch over.
Yeah. Is this the 2FA thing?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I thought they sent out an email way back when saying we all had to turn on 2FA or we would lose access to Ceph.
Something prompted me over a year ago to reset some things in GitHub, and that was it. It was offered as an option, and it didn't cause any trouble. Just needed to stick it in my Android, whatever it is, TOTP app.
Yeah, I just set up one of my YubiKeys.
All right, so I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware that you weren't surprised by losing access to your GitHub there. If you have feedback on how we make the transition, follow up on the dev list Ilya had posted there.
I wish I knew how to follow. I'll let y'all read. I'll see if I can learn more what to do. But I mean, they probably know. I just don't. The requirement to make the organization add everybody back seems like a real pain.
Right. There are some GitHub docs about how to do this, and it recommends that when you enable it, you also send out re-invites to the people that it removes, so that once they enable it on their account, they can get their access back.
I'm confused why GitHub couldn't just not provide the access to the projects that require it, unless the authenticating user did it, and then it would be opt in, and you'd bump into it when you're trying to merge to the highway, and you just fix it, and then everything, there'd be no intervention required.
Hey, GitHub's an AI company now. They are thinking about big things. They don't have time for that.
It seems like it'd be easier for them too. But anyway.
All right, let's move on. Somia wants to talk about log data and its interactions with per bucket policy.
Yeah, Casey. So this is a follow-up to our discussion about how to disable logging for the zone. It may not be related to only sync policies in general. I see that in many places we check for the flag log data to decide whether to log a particular operation or not in data log and by logs. So since this flag is no more configurable and is always set to true, can we replace it with supports data export API instead? That might ensure us that we take care of all the cases to disable logging for a zone.
Yes, I do think that we should move to the supports data export and supports data import things instead of the zone-wide flags. We haven't, right, we've had the logic that just hard codes log data in the zone group for a long time. And so it's not really an option. I think we should eventually just remove it entirely. That might be a good way to make sure that everything's converted over to the sync policy the version that understands sync policy at least.
Yeah, at least in this case, like if I understand, only sync module would know whether it can export data or whether logging should be enabled or not, right? There is no other way to know.
Well, there's supports data export is part of the sync module interface, yeah. But
Yeah.
there's also some per bucket stuff. I forget where those functions live. Some kind of policy handler type.
Yes.
And you can query a particular bucket.
Yeah. So I think sync handler pipes, at least from my understanding, they don't create pipes at all. If the sync is disabled for a particular direction for one source from the destination zone. But in this case, in general multi-site case, we will have bidirectional sync enabled by default, right? So to disable for a particular zone, I think sync module manager is the only way to know.
Sorry, I didn't quite follow that.
So
I mean, most of the places where we are, like when we're writing an object, we decide whether to write it to the data log or the BI log. That's like a per bucket level decision, right? And so I think it makes sense to go through the per bucket sync
right.
policy stuff.
So I think that is already there to filter through the sync policy pipes if there are any configured per bucket. But post that, at least in this case, since archive wouldn't have any sync policies configured, it would pass that check. And then after that, I think the only way to check whether we need to log a particular operation or not based on a zone tier type, I think we can use only this support data export.
Okay, I see. So I guess I don't really know how to make these things, these two separate things, the same thing. How do we teach this whole sync
Okay.
policy framework about the sync modules
Oh.
support or not?
I can look into it. I briefly looked into it. Like in sync policy handler usually creates pipes, even in the default multi-site cases. It can check for tier type and then make a decision whether to create pipes or not. But the problem was sync policy handler was called before the service manager, sync module service manager gets initialized. So the supports data export was always returning false for all the zones.
I see. Okay. Do you think we'd be able to change the initialization order to fix that?
Yeah, I'll look into it. Probably, maybe otherwise, in worst case, maybe we need to call it twice.
Yeah. If there are circular dependencies, then changing the order might break something else. It's hard to tell.
Right. Okay, then first I'll look into changing the sync policy handler itself. I'll submit, I mean, update the PR. If it looks fine, it's okay. Otherwise I'll change this log data to support data export.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that's essentially what your PR was doing. It was just using the log data flag
Right.
instead of the sync module thing. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Hopefully that works. And I think that accomplishes what I was looking for, making sync policy understand the sync modules.
That's all I have. Thanks, guys.
Great. Any other thoughts on sync policy or sync modules or multi-site in general? Any other agenda topics? All right. let's call it then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.